October 1943. At an altitude of 7,000 meters above the center of the Reich, General Josef Kammhuber was confidently observing the traces on radar. American bombers crossed the border without escort. Once again. On the cockpit, Luftwaffe pilots prepared for what they unceremoniously called turkey shooting. For them, it was just another ordinary morning, the slow destruction of flying targets that insisted on crossing the German sky unprotected. This sense of absolute control was not illusory. It was statistics. Out of every 10 heavy bombers that crossed German airspace without fighter cover, at least 3 did not return. The Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters chose the moment of attack, dived at high speed, and disappeared before the American gunners had time to react. The Reich's air doctrine worked, until that month. What the German pilots did not yet know was that at the same time as they celebrated yet another successful ambush, a new type of escort was emerging in the West. A light, fast fighter with the autonomy to fly to Berlin and back. The P-51 Mustang would not just be an airplane, it would be the end of an era. And when he appeared, the laughter stopped. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story with surgical precision. In 1945, out of every 10 German fighters shot down, 9 crashed without even hitting a single target. The Luftwaffe, which 2 years earlier had decided the pace and field of combat, now took off only to try to get back alive. The Reich's airspace, which had been a safe haven, had become a hunting ground, and the hunters didn't speak German. It all started with a technical detail that seemed too unlikely to be real. Bombers that crossed Germany escorted to the end, with no early returns, no gaps. What seemed like a navigational error was actually the arrival of a new type of fighter. First came the reports in Leipzig, then in Munich, and then about Berlin. The German pilots understood. The air war had been turned upside down. If you value facts that expose the invisible gears of history, consider subscribing and leaving your support. This technical and human journey is only possible thanks to you. By the end of 1943, the Luftwaffe was operating like a deadly precision watch. Its pilots knew exactly where and when to strike. They didn't have to guess. It was enough to wait. German radars tracked the streams of bombers crossing the English Channel. From the signals, air traffic controllers calculated the exact point at which the American escort fighters, limited by range, would make the return turn. It was in this space, beyond the border of the P-47 Thunderbolts, that the sky opened up for the German attack. They called this moment the golden hour. For Americans, it was the beginning of the nightmare. German fighters took off in successive waves. While one group engaged the bombers, another landed, refueled, rearmed, and took off again. In some operations, the same pilot flew 3 sorties against a single bombing mission. The B-17s, even armed with up to 13 50-caliber machine guns, were not enough. The box formation, designed to maximize defensive fire, had critical gaps, especially in the nose and lower sides. The Luftwaffe knew this, and it exploited these vulnerabilities with high-speed frontal assaults, a tactic developed by aces like Major Egon Meyer and improved by units like JG-1 and JG-11. On October 14, 1943, the second Schweinfurt mission became the cruelest example of this doctrine. Of the 291 bombers that crossed German airspace that morning, 60 were shot down, and another 17 landed so badly damaged that they were scrapped. More than 600 airmen were killed or captured in just one day. The U.S. Air Force named that October 14th, Black Thursday. The Luftwaffe ironically called it routine. For German pilots, each bombing mission was an opportunity to extend their victories. Men like Walter Dahl, Heinz Beer, and Hermann Graf had dozens, a few, hundreds, of slaughters in a short time. There was a palpable confidence in the air, almost arrogant. They believed, based on hard data, that German doctrine was simply superior. After all, they were facing unprotected bombers. The logic seemed unbeatable, but it was a deceptive logic, based on an absence, the absence of an escort in the heart of Germany, and this detail, initially despised, carried in itself the harbinger of the end. The Luftwaffe did not realize that its success was anchored not in its own strength, but in the momentary limitation of the enemy. German strategists underestimated the American ability to solve problems with scale and speed, and that's when the scales started to tip. In October 1943, as bombers fell on Schweinfurt, American factories were operating in 3 shifts to solve the Escort problem. At Willow Run, Michigan, a production line was about to reach an unthinkable logistical milestone, the production of a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. The same was true of fighter aircraft. What the Germans ignored was the power of a nation that produced not only weapons, but also steel, fuel, spare parts, and most importantly, large-scale trained pilots. While the Luftwaffe formed elites, the United States formed armies. In 1943 alone, the US trained about 84,000 new pilots. By comparison, Germany graduated fewer than 20,000 in the same period. The difference was structural. The Germans bet on experience and precision. The Americans bet on volume and adaptation. Here, an often ignored fact becomes impossible to neglect. In 1944, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft. Germany, 39,000. This colossal difference shows that the war wasn't just being decided in the skies, it was being decided in the factories. If this number surprised you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because in this conflict, she really won. But the Germans did not yet know this. To them, control of the sky was evident. Its pilots still landed, laughed, and counted kills as trophies. The view from above reinforced the narrative of superiority. Bombers destroyed, formations shattered, parachutes on fire. However, on the other side of the Atlantic, something quiet and systematic was happening. A new type of fighter was being adjusted. A plane that flew farther, faster, and more fuel-efficient. The P-51 Mustang already existed, but had not yet been seen over Germany. When he appeared, he would not come alone, and its reach would change everything. Because, contrary to what the German generals believed, the air war could not be won with skill or courage alone. It was won with scale, and the American scale was about to swallow the Reich sky. In 1943, the greatest paradox of American aviation manifested itself daily over the skies of Germany. The best-equipped air force in the world was unable to protect its own bombers. The weakness of the system was not in the production nor in the number of aircraft, but in a simple technical factor: range. The B-17s flew deep penetration missions up to 800 or 900 kilometers inside enemy territory, but escort fighters, especially the P-47 Thunderbolt, could only fly just over 300 miles before needing to return. This detail created a risk zone known to both sides. The Germans called it the American Dead Zone, a stretch of the sky where bombers flew absolutely alone without protection. It was there that the attacks came en masse, and it was there that hundreds of aviators died every week. The Thunderbolt, while formidable in combat, with its Pratt & Whitney radial engine and rugged frame, was a close-quarters fighter. Its wide fuselage accommodated extra tanks, but still insufficient to accompany the B-17s to targets such as Regensburg, Bremen, or Schweinfurt. The P-38 Lightning, meanwhile, offered greater autonomy and promising performance in theory. But its 2 Allison engines had severe mechanical failures at high altitudes, controls freezing, combustion chamber failures, and loss of power. In practice, Lightning became a risk for the crews themselves. American pilots were facing an unprecedented war of attrition. The standard mission of a bomber lasted between 7 and 9 hours. For about 3 of those hours, there were no Allied fighters around. In the meantime, B-17 formations flew together in defensive formations called combat box, each equipped with dozens of 50-caliber machine guns. But the theory did not hold up. The formations could not achieve full mutual coverage. There were blind spots. And above all, there was panic. When the FW-190s and Bf-109s attacked in groups, gunners tried to track targets at closing speeds in excess of 600 km/h. They shot in any direction, often in nothing. Bombers returned riddled with holes. Others did not return. The statistics were cruel. In August 1943, on the Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission, 60 bombers were shot down in a single day. More than 2,500 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. And those who survived told stories that became a warning in the bases of England. We will not be able to continue like this. 8th Air Force Commander General Ira Eaker wrote in a memo to the Pentagon, "Our men are going to hell and back, but many do not return, and they won't come back until we have long-range escort fighters." Germany saw this with technical superiority. Luftwaffe strategists interpreted American losses as strategic weakness. Intelligence reports concluded that the United States would never be able to solve the problem of autonomy in a single-engine fighter. This limitation, they believed, was intrinsic to engineering. A light plane could not, at the same time, carry enough fuel, maintain speed, maneuverability, and combat capability. It was physically impossible. This diagnosis underpinned the entire German air defense doctrine. Factories and airfields were built in the center of the country because it was confidently believed that enemy fighters would never get that far. The Germans bet big on this assumption, but they bet wrong. On the American side, the urgency became critical. The loss rate reached 25% in some missions. The rate of replacement of crews and aircraft was beginning to fall below the safety line. And more serious, morale was beginning to crumble. Scorers reported the feeling of helplessness. We would shoot for hours without seeing a friendly fighter in the sky. Many crew members began to doubt the strategy of daylight bombing. One major wrote in his diary, "We are big, noisy, and slow, and we are alone." The phrase spread as a symbol of despair. Still, the flights continued, because American doctrine, the doctrine of daylight bombing accuracy, depended on persistence. The targets were too strategic to ignore: ball bearings, refineries, engine plants, railroad lines. But each unescorted attack was a roulette wheel, and the Luftwaffe, increasingly daring, began to organize attacks with up to 200 fighters in a single mission. The American formations, seen from afar, looked like fortresses, but up close they were slow, predictable, and saturated targets. German air superiority, even if temporary, was real. They controlled the time, place, and intensity of the fighting. On the ground, the Germans celebrated. In America, engineers worked in silence, because while the Luftwaffe's eyes were on the Bavarian skies, a different airframe was being tested in California. A new project with a cleaner design, bladed wings, reduced drag, and a simple proposal: to fly farther than any single-engine fighter in history. And although it was still in the experimental phase, the first prototype had already made it clear to some observers the range problem was about to be solved. In October 1943, the same Luftwaffe that laughed at the unprotected bombers did not even suspect that in less than 5 months it would see American fighters flying over the heart of the Reich and not returning, because they simply wouldn't have to go back sooner. What until then was considered impossible would soon become routine, and a plane named after a horse would change the course of the air war. The P-51 Mustang was not born out of an American need. It was, in fact, the result of a British urgency. In 1940, with England's skies ablaze after the Battle of Britain, the British government was looking for ways to bolster its air forces and contracted with North American Aviation to produce the P-40 Warhawk fighter under license. But the company, led by James H. Dutch Kindleberger, proposed something different: to design a completely new, more modern fighter with better aerodynamics and performance. The proposal was bold: a new fighter ready in 120 days. The first prototype, designated NA-73X, flew in October of that same year. The result was promising: an extremely clean fuselage, laminar flow wings developed by engineer Edgar Schmude, and remarkable performance at low altitudes. But there was a problem, and it wasn't a small one. The Allison V1710 engine, while reliable in low and medium flights, suffered severe power losses in excess of 15,000 feet, exactly where the bombers operated. In 1941, the Mustang was not yet the solution to the Escort problem. It was just another project with limitations. It was then that a British mind saw what others did not. Ronald Harker, a test driver for Rolls-Royce, flew the Mustang equipped with the Allison engine and instantly recognized its potential. The airframe was perfect, more aerodynamic than the Spitfire, more efficient than any RAF fighter. He just needed to breathe better at altitude. Harker suggested equipping the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine, the same engine used in the most advanced versions of Spitfires. The idea was taken forward. The British installed the Merlin in a Mustang cell. The result exceeded all expectations. The plane that had previously climbed with effort began to climb like a rocket. The maximum speed jumped from 610 to 710 km/h. The operating altitude was extended to more than 12,000 meters. And more importantly, performance remained consistent throughout the flight envelope. The fusion of American industrial pragmatism with British precision engineering had created something rare, a fighter that could fight on an equal footing with the Luftwaffe's best planes and still fly twice the distance. The combination was so promising that the Packard Motor Company in the United States licensed production of the Merlin engine for scale manufacturing. The P-51B was born, a refined, optimized version, built with the strategic goal of changing the course of the war. Every aspect of the Mustang has been thought out with precision. The laminar flow wing reduced drag by up to 30% compared to previous models. The lightweight but robust airframe accommodated more fuel with lower structural weight. The external tanks, from 75 to 108 gallons, could be dropped in combat without compromising the integrity of the aircraft. And the Merlin engine, with its two-stage supercharger, allowed it to maintain maximum power even at 30,000 feet, exactly where bombers needed protection most. Autonomy was the key. With additional tanks, the P-51B reached 300 kilometers of effective range, enough to escort bombers to Berlin, engage them in combat, return to base, and still keep fuel in reserve. No single-engine fighter in the world did that. The Germans, however, were still stuck in the paradigm of limitation. Luftwaffe intelligence reports classified the Mustang as a tactical, restricted-use short-range fighter. They completely underestimated the real range of the P-51. This misreading would seal the fate of their defensive operations, because while fighters like the FW-190A were optimized for endurance and power at low altitudes, and the Bf-109G for fast maneuvers and aggressive climbs, the Mustang combined efficiency, power, and strategic depth. He didn't just keep up with the bombers. He anticipated them. He could start the fight even before the Luftwaffe approached, and after combat it still hunted targets on the ground, destroyed locomotives, cut supply lines. It was a complete system, a fighter with a bomber's soul. But there was still something more symbolic. The Mustang was the portrait of collaboration between allies. While Germany was increasingly immersed in isolated, elitist, and desperate solutions, the United States and Great Britain were joining forces. American engineering produced on a large scale. British precision refined performance. American doctrine adapted. The result was a fighter that no one foresaw, and that no one, until then, had been able to stop. In November 1943, the first P-51Bs began to arrive in Europe. The 354th Fighter Group, designated the Pioneer Mustang Group, was the first to test them on real missions, and the impact was immediate. Lieutenant Col. Glenn Duncan, after his first flight, said, "The Mustang was like driving a sports car after getting out of a truck." But the Germans still didn't know what was coming, because although the Mustangs were already in the air, they had not yet crossed the most symbolic line of air warfare, the airspace over Berlin. This was about to happen, and when it happened, it wasn't just the scope that surprised, it was the permanence. A fighter that wouldn't go away, that it didn't disappear at the expected time, that flew side by side with bombers to the heart of the Reich. Major Klaus Mitusch of JG-26 would report days later, "They arrived, and they did not return." The war changed at that moment. And the following month, the Luftwaffe would have its first clear vision of what it meant to face an enemy that knew how to produce not only fighters, but range. Because the Mustang was no longer a promise. It was the harbinger of the fall. On the morning of March 4, 1944, German radars picked up a massive formation coming from the west. It was nothing new. Heavy bombers from the US 8th Air Force had become frequent visitors in the skies over the Reich. What drew attention that day was something else. Something that shouldn't be there. Something that, according to all calculations, could not be. Next to the B-17s, there were small, mobile, fast points, organized in closed wings. Fighters. The impossible had happened. For the first time in the war, American bombers were flying all the way to Berlin with full escort. Not just halfway, not just as far as the Rhine. They had company all the way to the target, and back. The flight of 660 bombers to the capital of the Third Reich was escorted by dozens of P-51 Mustangs, newly arrived on the European front. As they crossed the heart of the German Empire, the Mustangs showed that they were not a passing escort. They were a permanent presence. Luftwaffe radio intercepts recorded confusing dialogue. "Confirm. Are the enemy fighters still there? The answer, in a tone of incredulity, yes, they don't back down. German doctrine collapsed in real time. For years, the Luftwaffe based its strategy on a technicality, the limitation of the range of enemy fighters. This belief shaped the geography of the bases, the tactics of interception, and even the timing of operations. And that day, with a single flight, that foundation collapsed. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. But Germany never believed that the Americans could turn a fighter jet into a strategic weapon. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content about the invisible gears of war. Because what happened on that flight was more than a tactical victory. It was a psychological blow. German pilots, once confident that the skies over Berlin were unreachable, now had to fight where they had previously only watched. Interception missions have lost the surprise factor. The Mustangs escorted, fought, and pursued. And even after the bombing, they were still there. For the Luftwaffe, air warfare had transformed. The Reich Rhine was now a hunting ground, and the hunters had switched sides. In the following weeks, a new type of statistic began to emerge in the reports. German fighters shot down 700, 800, even 1,000 kilometers from the coast. A Luftwaffe intelligence major wrote in confidence, "We are being fought in our own sky, and worse, with effectiveness." What would come next would be even more devastating, because the Mustangs weren't just there to protect, they were there to destroy. And this new role, active and ruthless, would forever change the arithmetic of air warfare. In a matter of weeks, German tactics that had been perfected over years began to crumble. The Luftwaffe, which until then had operated with strategic freedom, began to respond and no longer dictate the pace of combat. Before, it was the German fighters who chose the moment of the attack. Now they had to intercept bombers under constant pressure from escort fighters that did not go missing. The P-51 Mustang didn't just accompany formations to their targets. It flew overhead, in front of and behind them, with enough fuel to choose where and when to intervene. The superiority was not only in technical performance, but in tactical autonomy. With greater range, better visibility, and more effective communications, American pilots now took on the offensive role. On several occasions, Mustangs patrolled German retreat routes, waiting for fighters trying to escape after their unsuccessful attacks. Others chased aircraft to their bases, breaking an unspoken code of air warfare, not to attack during landings. But this was total war, and the rules have changed. Entire units of the Luftwaffe began to operate with hesitation. Records revealed drastic drops in the engagement rate. In April 1944, the JG-3 group reported that only 40% of its aircraft were being launched on interception missions. The reasons varied: lack of fuel, logistical problems, but above all, the recognition that facing formations protected by the Mustangs was almost suicide. A veteran JG-26 pilot described it this way: "Now we're the ones waiting on the radio. We wait for the right moment. We are waiting for reinforcements. We hope we don't die." The German tactic of frontal attacks, developed with precision to exploit bomber blind spots, had become obsolete. Mustangs flew in loose wings, protecting the flanks, and when they detected enemy groupings, they dived with energy, breaking the German formation even before the first shot at the B-17s. The Luftwaffe went from predator to prey. Their bases, once starting points, have become burning points of return. Mustangs attacked runways, hangars, fuel convoys. They began to hunt ground targets with the same precision with which they escorted in the air. On many occasions, German fighters could barely take off. When they did, they were already being chased before they gained altitude. The collapse was operational. Rotary takeoff tactics, which allowed the same pilot to perform multiple missions on the same day, became unfeasible. The risk of taking off under attack was as high as that of flying into combat. In just 3 months, the Luftwaffe began to operate in absolute defensive mode, and the cruelest was the irony. His doctrine of air superiority, built on engineering, experience, and daring, was being defeated by an enemy who, until 2 years earlier, could barely fly beyond the Rhine. German confidence evaporated with the repetition of the attacks. Mustangs were no longer a surprise, they were routine, and this routine imposed a new reality. The Reich's airspace was occupied, not temporarily, but permanently. In July 1944, an internal Luftwaffe report warned, "Our fighters are being shot down before they even sight the bombers." The phrase was repeated in command meetings as a diagnosis with no cure. Because it wasn't just a change in tactics, it was a change of era. The force that dominated the sky now hid from him, and the German skies, once a symbol of invulnerability, have become enemy territory. But the worst was yet to come. Because the Mustangs, now lords of the skies, would pave the way for a deeper attack. An attack that didn't just target aircraft, but the fuel that kept them in the air. And this cut would be surgical. While the Mustang fighters dominated the sky, there was another, less visible but even more decisive force moving the warboard. It was the constant sound of industrial conveyors, cranes operating at dawn, engines being assembled in series. American industry. The real turning point of the war happened not only in European airspace but in the production sheds of Long Beach, Dallas, Buffalo, Inglewood, and Detroit. By 1944, the United States was training 11,000 new pilots a month. It was a spare stopover impossible for any other nation to follow. For every pilot lost in combat, dozens were ready to replace him. The Luftwaffe, on the other hand, saw its veteran cadre evaporate without having time to form replacements. The same pattern applied to airplanes. While Germany tried to keep its Bf-109s and FW-190s operational, with cannibalized parts and rationed fuel, American factories were producing thousands of Mustangs at a steady pace. North American aviation, in 1944 alone, delivered more than 7,500 P-51s, nearly 21 a day. The planes came out painted, calibrated, tested, and ready to cross the Atlantic. And each of them was more than a machine. It was an extension of the logistical power of a country that had made war a science of production. The factories operated in 3 shifts. Women riveted wings, teenagers welded fuselages, engineers calculated more efficient shipping routes. The war was won by a collective gear. While Germany adapted bombed workshops to assemble jet fighters with forced labor, the United States standardized excellence. Each Mustang was identical to the last. Same parts, same panels, same instructions. This allowed for faster training, simpler maintenance, and more agile replacements. The American doctrine was clear: quantity with quality. And it worked. The American supply chain linked 5 continents, from rubber from Brazil to Canadian aluminum, from licensed British engines to mass production in Ohio. Everything converged on a single function: sustaining constant pressure against the axis. Fuel flowed through African ports, Gulf pipelines, and Atlantic convoys, and even when ships were sunk, the next shipments were already on their way. The Luftwaffe, on the other hand, was sinking into scarcity. The synthetic produced in Germany did not keep up with demand. Pilots were told to fly less. Missions were cancelled due to lack of aviation kerosene. At some bases, training flights were halted for weeks. The German war industry, suffocated by bombing raids and the loss of resources, was trying to survive while the American one prospered. The cruelest proof of this was the Me-262, the revolutionary German jet fighter. Superior to any other aircraft in direct combat, the 262 was fast, powerful, and lethal, but only on paper. In practice, it was not available in sufficient numbers. Each unit took months to complete. Parts were missing, engines exploded on takeoff, and runways were bombed before pilots could master it. The 262 was a jewel drowned in scarce oil and broken logistics. It was the symbol of the war that Germany wanted to wage, and could not. Meanwhile, the Mustang, without being exotic, flew every day. With each mission, there was more. For each loss, a replacement. And more than that, the United States wasn't just keeping the number of fighter jets in the air, it was increasing. Instead of exhaustion, there was accumulation. With each month, air superiority became more absolute. An American pilot could fly in a new, fueled, overhauled, and spare parts aircraft waiting in the hangar. A German pilot, by contrast, flew the same plane for weeks, praying that the next mission would not break the landing gear or that there would be new tires in stock. The air war had ceased to be a technical duel. It had become a logistical marathon. And in this marathon, only one side had the fuel to cross the finish line. General Galland, one of the most respected voices in the Luftwaffe, would later acknowledge, "We had good planes, good pilots, and good tactics, but they had it all on an industrial scale, and that won." But supremacy in the heavens was not yet the end, because while the Mustangs cleared the airspace, The bombers began to target not just factories, but the very lungs of the German war effort, the refineries. And when the fuel stopped reaching the hangars, not even the fighters that were still working could take off. In the spring of 1944, what began as a war of maneuver became a cruel mirror before the eyes of the Luftwaffe. It was no longer about speed, angle of attack, or individual courage. It was about presence, constant, overwhelming, unchallenged. The first emblematic phrase came not from a pilot on a mission, but from a marshal on the ground. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, said bitterly, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew that the war was lost." And he was not alone. By this time, even the most loyal officers to the Nazi regime recognized that something essential had been broken, the idea of German invulnerability. Pilots who had previously hunted in packs now flew cautiously, avoiding confrontations, asking permission to engage. The sky that had been his fortress was now a trap. A pilot of JG-54 wrote in his diary, "Before, we hunted them. Now, we are hunted down before we even see the enemy." Censored reports found after the war reveal letters sent to families and never delivered, where young airmen confessed fear, frustration, and doubt. A 22-year-old lieutenant wrote, "They were everywhere. They flew higher, farther, faster, and they didn't leave." The outage wasn't just operational, it was psychological. The myth of the Luftwaffe's racial, doctrinal, and technical superiority, forged since the 1930s, collapsed under the reality that the enemy they had ridiculed now dominated all fronts, including the sky. The Mustang wasn't just a machine, it was a message. A symbol that the technical empire of the Reich had been overtaken by an alliance that united engineering, production, and strategy, and that this new type of war was not won with promises or isolated heroes, but with logistics. The breach of trust was so severe that some units began to hide losses, forging reports in an attempt to avoid internal punishment. The Luftwaffe had become a besieged army in its own rear, and the reality was harsher than any propaganda. By July 1944, the United States was producing, on average, 2,600 fighters per month. Germany, only 650. This difference translated into the sky, where every downed Mustang was replaced in days, while every FW-190 lost was an absence felt for weeks. If this number is impressive, comment below with the phrase "logistics wins," because that's what happened. The American victory began in the factories, but was sealed in the blank gaze of drivers who no longer knew how to face the impossible. Lieutenant Karl Rammelt, one of the Luftwaffe's aces, would admit years later, "They flew as if they knew they had already won, and we flew as if we were trying to deny it. But there was a group of pilots who no longer denied it. I just waited for the end." And among them, a growing number began to make radical decisions, because when defeat becomes inevitable, some choose not to fall in combat. They choose not to take off. And that, for an air army, is the real end. The doctrine of the Luftwaffe was forged in another era, with other premises. It was born of the blitzkrieg, of the speed, of the precise blow that paralyzed the enemy before he could react. It was based on light, aggressive fighters, operated by an elite of experienced pilots. The central idea was simple and arrogant. They didn't have to be many, just better. The aerial victory would come from quality, not quantity. This mentality worked in Poland, France, and for a time, in the skies of occupied Europe. But in 1944 it began to crumble, because Americans didn't play the same game. While Germany was betting on excellence, the United States was betting on consistency. They trained thousands of medium pilots, flying standardized planes supported by a global supply chain. The Luftwaffe, seeing its model fail, tried to respond as best it could, but its responses sounded increasingly desperate. They developed armored versions of the FW-190, the so-called Sturmbucker, with steel panels and heavy armament, designed to destroy bombers with a single frontal attack. But the added weight compromised maneuverability, and with Mustangs lurking, these planes became slow targets, swallowed up before reaching formations. Frontal attacks, a tactic once feared, now bordered on suicide. The doctrine insisted on aggressiveness, but the context demanded something else: survival. And there was no doctrine that taught that. Desperation led to increasingly radical improvisations. Ram missions, where fighters were deliberately flown into bombers, began to be considered. and, on rare occasions, executed. But nothing stopped the flow. The Mustang, with autonomy, speed, and height, dismantled every attempt at tactical resistance. The introduction of the Me-262, the first operational jet fighter in history, seemed like a promising response, but it came too late. Its production was limited, its fuel scarce, and its operation complex. Of the more than 1,400 examples built, less than 300 ever entered effective combat, and even they were often destroyed on the ground before taking off. The Mustang, once again, was there. It patrolled runways, hunted down vulnerable jets during ascent, attacked supply convoys, destroyed hangars. Each month, the Luftwaffe saw its operational space shrink. The doctrine of tactical superiority has become a burden. There was no more room for fair duels, nor for elegant maneuvers. It was a war of attrition, and in this type of war, whoever produces the most wins. The Luftwaffe could no longer fly, and when it flew, it couldn't attack, and when he attacked, he couldn't come back. Mustangs circled over the rubble of German arrogance, hunting down the last vestiges of an air force that, 2 years earlier, had seemed invincible. By September 1944, Luftwaffe reports that more than half of its losses came from attacks during takeoffs and landings. The air war had turned into a logistical massacre. Tactical supremacy had become irrelevant in the face of industrial supremacy. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, who was responsible for part of the German aviation planning, confessed in a confidential letter, "We are fighting with courage and tradition. They are struggling with scale and method. It's a different war. And we lose before we understand." But the United States was still not satisfied with the destruction of the German wings. The next target didn't fly, but it made everything fly. It was the fuel. And without it, even the last plane became just expensive scrap. At the height of the air war, behind the numbers and statistics were young faces, trembling voices, and eyes that didn't blink for hours. American pilots, many in their early 20s, took off from English fields with the responsibility of escorting hundreds of bombers into the heart of the Reich. They knew that if they failed, hundreds of men would be burned to death or parachuted over enemy territory. For them, flying wasn't just about fighting, it was about protecting. And this mission, loaded with moral weight, required not only skill, but nerves of steel. On the other hand, the German reality was even more cruel. The rapid pace of losses forced the High Command to send pilots with less than 60 hours of flight time to the front line. Many had not even fired in real training. They were boys, often with an expression of dread even before takeoff. The remaining veterans looked at them with bitter silence. They knew they wouldn't come back. A JG-2 pilot wrote, "They arrive today, learn the radio tomorrow, and fly on Saturday. They do not fight. They are slaughtered." The contrast was stark. While the United States produced pilots with months of preparation, simulators, psychologists, and collective doctrine, the Luftwaffe hurriedly trained fighters, throwing them into an already dominated sky. Fatigue was visible. German pilots reported tremors, insomnia, and emotional outbursts. There were instances of disorientation in the air, panic during maneuvers, and even silent refusals to take off. Engines purposely damaged, radios turned off. Physical warfare was becoming an internal war. Many wrote letters to their families, not with pride, but with early farewells. "If this letter arrives, it's because I haven't come back, but it's also because we knew we wouldn't be back," read a note found years later in the ruins of a base near Hanover. Americans also felt the weight, seeing bombers exploding even under escort, hearing screams on the radio, and landing knowing that dozens would not return made each mission a burden. There were pilots who spent the entire flight listening to the names of their friends being called frequently, and not responding. The sound of silence was as heavy as that of the 50s firing. A lieutenant in the 354th Fighter Group wrote, "Watching a Mustang crash was hard enough, but to see 5 B-17s fall together as if the sky had torn apart was a pain that would not go away." The emotional resistance of both Americans and Germans began to be eroded by repetition. The Germans for the certainty of defeat, Americans for the wear and tear of facing the horror every day. But there was a difference. While the Germans wrote about the end, the Americans wrote about duty. While one side tried to survive, the other believed it was winning for a greater cause. That made a difference. The American pilot knew that there was fuel waiting, that his plane would be repaired, that there would be hot food and a new uniform. The German driver knew that there was no spare tire, that there was a lack of oil, that the next mission might be his last. This technical asymmetry has become psychological asymmetry. The Nazi doctrine, which promised honor, purity, and racial dominance, now delivered fear, failure, and isolation. The propaganda was no longer convincing. Faith was fading. And the Mustangs, increasingly numerous, were the daily reminder that this war was no longer about equals. But the worst for the Luftwaffe had not yet been written, because the skies that burned the engines would now also destroy the lungs of the Reich. The next step would not only come from above, it would reach the source of it all, the fuel that made the machine turn. And when it stopped flowing, there would be no pilot, doctrine, or bravery capable of taking off again. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe had lost what was left of its autonomy, the ability to choose when and where to fight. Until then, even with increasing losses, the German High Command could still define reaction windows, strategic times, zones, with minimal local superiority. But that ended when Mustangs began patrolling the Reich as if it were a natural extension of their bases. The term sovereign airspace has lost its meaning. There were no longer any borders. From Kiel to Munich, from Essen to Dresden, the sky was American. Germany had stopped flying, literally. The military concept of aerial denial, preventing the enemy from using its own airspace, was executed with mathematical precision. The Mustangs flew over airfields before dawn, waiting for the first takeoffs. Some positioned themselves on secondary runways, attacking planes in taxis. Others formed interdiction squadrons, not to protect bombers, but to prevent any German flights. The number of aircraft destroyed on the ground exceeded, in several months, the number shot down in combat. In August 1944, more than 450 German fighters were destroyed in the hangars themselves, before they even fired. Each takeoff became a calculated risk. In certain regions, such as the industrial center of the Ruhr, the Germans began to move their planes to improvised roads or fields, hiding them under foliage and tarpaulins, as if trying to erase the very existence of the Air Force. A pilot of JG-27 reported, "We no longer take off to fight. We get up to try not to be seen." And even when they managed to escape, the Mustangs were there waiting. They flew at varying altitudes in pairs and squadrons, creating layers of fighter. The German pilot upon takeoff had seconds to choose, climb and face or retreat and hide, if there was time. The Luftwaffe's communications, once precise and coordinated, became confusing. Bases lost contact, formations were disbanded before forming, and commanders preferred to cancel operations rather than see their units decimated before combat. The Americans, in turn, began to establish fighter shifts in the air. Germany no longer knew when it was being watched, because it was always being watched. Air supremacy, once a tactical advantage, was now a continuous psychological and territorial presence. German soil, which in 1939 was the command center of an unbeatable offensive force, had become a homeless prison. The irony reached its apex in Berlin, where even the Reich leaders themselves began to use underground routes to move between high command buildings, fearful of air raids during the day. The capital of the Third Reich, which had once ruled the world, now hid from the light. In rural areas, German civilians no longer looked up at the sky. Looking was useless. There was only one certainty: the Americans were there, and even when they didn't attack, they were waiting. Late attempts to reorganize squadrons failed for lack of fuel, spare parts, and morale. The Luftwaffe came to rely on combat-adapted training planes, unprepared volunteers, and improvised solutions. But none of this changed the central fact: the sky of Germany no longer belonged to Germany. And the most devastating thing was to realize that this loss would not come with fanfares, nor with a decisive attack. It was happening quietly, every day, with every plane that didn't take off, every mission cancelled, every pilot who gave up. Defeat had ceased to be a strategic possibility. It had become a geographical reality. A German intelligence officer, in an internal report, wrote, "The air war was won by time, scale, and scope. There's nowhere else to fight because there's nowhere else to fly." But the Allies still had one goal in mind. The next target would not be airplanes. It would be the fuel tanks that still fed what was left of them. And when those tanks dried up, the Luftwaffe would not only cease to fight, it would cease to exist. The real collapse of the Luftwaffe didn't happen in the clouds. It happened in the fuel tanks. When Mustangs began escorting bombers into the heart of Germany, a new phase of the war opened, the annihilation of the Reich's energy infrastructure. For the first time, the Allies could accurately target previously untouchable critical facilities, refineries, hydrogenation plants, synthetic oil deposits. Names that until then had only been on intelligence maps became frequent targets. Leuna, Pölitz, Berlin, Blechhammer, Merseburg. Each of these plants was responsible for directly supplying German aviation, and in a matter of weeks, they began to disappear from the map. Operation Point Blank, with its successive waves of B-17s and B-24s protected by long-range fighters, turned entire industrial complexes into smoldering ash. Germany, without access to natural oil since the start of the war, relied on synthetic fuel, an advanced but vulnerable technology. When the bombers hit the refineries, the Luftwaffe didn't just lose fuel, it lost the ability to exist. By August 1944, oil production had fallen by 90%. In September, it fell again, and in October, some air units reported receiving only 10% of the minimum quota for patrol missions. It is important to stop at this point and note an impressive fact. Between 1943 and 1944, American production of jet fuel was more than 15 times higher than Germany's total production, even adding synthetic and natural oil. If this number surprises you, comment below with the phrase "shocking data," because it was this data and not ideological promises that won the war. The break was not slow. It was systemic. Pilots stopped training. Operational units were ordered to fly only in extreme cases. Some planes were fueled only to take off, attack an immediate target, and attempt to glide back again. Entire missions were cancelled due to lack of kerosene, and this affected not only aviation. Tanks were stopped. Trucks were not allowed to transport ammunition. Troops were forced to retreat because there was no diesel for the panzer divisions. Nazi mechanized warfare, which once advanced at breakneck speed across Europe, now choked within its own borders, with no fuel to escape. General Speer, the armaments minister, described the moment as a logistical blackout, and it all started when the P-51 crossed the line where the previous fighters retreated. The constant presence of Mustangs over the refineries forced the Germans to concentrate the defense on fixed points. But with few fighters left, there was barely any way to respond. And even when they did manage to react, they were outclassed, hunted down and slaughtered. The Luftwaffe turned into a defensive spasm. It was the end of the war of initiative. Mustangs, protecting bombers and attacking tactical targets, served a dual role. They allowed attack and prevented defense. The result was devastating. The flames of the affected refineries could be seen for miles. Black, dense smoke rose for days. Civilian workers were trying to put out fires without equipment. And when a plant was rebuilt, the next mission destroyed it again. There was no breath, and there was no replacement. Germany had lost the battle for oil. And without fuel, there was no more doctrine, no strategy, no bravery to sustain the war effort. An Allied intelligence report concluded in November 1944, the Luftwaffe is technically intact, but logistically dead, and even dead, she still took up space. But that space was also about to disappear, because now the next phase would no longer target airplanes or fuel. It would target brains. The high command, the radar stations, the radio towers. The destruction would become systemic and surgical. Decades after the end of the war, the echoes of defeat still resonated in the accounts of the men who once cut through the skies of Europe. Encounters between former enemies became common at conferences, ceremonies, and memoirs. Luftwaffe pilots and U.S. Air Force veterans, now gray-haired, shook hands that had previously aimed at fiery crossings at 5,000 feet, 8,000 meters up. Amid belated smiles and looks that seemed to weigh more than words, a pattern emerged. Respect. Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's most respected aces, once said that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he felt no anger, he felt resignation. That was a machine that we couldn't match, and behind it, there was an industry that we couldn't even imagine. Walter Schuck, who faced Mustangs flying an Me-262, recalled that even with the advantage of speed, he never felt safe. They were everywhere, and they knew where to wait. Adolf Galland, a former Reich fighter general, summed it up with elegant bitterness. The P-51 was the best fighter of the war, and it came at the worst time for us. These testimonies were not just technical praise, they were moral confessions. They no longer saw the Mustang as just a superior plane. They saw it as the symbol of a war that they could not win, not for lack of courage, but for lack of structure. The myth of German superiority, cultivated for years in speeches and medals, dissolved in the face of the naked truth. American-British cooperation had created a war machine that combined the best of both worlds. A British engine, an American airframe, mass production, lethal range, flexible tactics, technology and pragmatism fused into a weapon with no weaknesses. In 1943, the Germans still believed they could win by genius. In 1944, they were won by the stopover. Many recognized this. Others, in silence, accepted. Allied pilots, in turn, also expressed admiration, not for the regime they fought, but for the men they faced in the skies. Risky missions, quick duels, decisions in seconds. There was, between both sides, the tacit understanding that those who survived saw things that words cannot explain. In one of these encounters, an American pilot approached his old enemy and said, "You fought for what you believed in. I fought for what I had to protect. And in the end, we survived those who told us to fight." It was a forgiveness without being said. The war, which so often erases faces and turns individuals into statistics, there revealed something rare: surviving humanity. One of the most symbolic moments came at a conference in Munich, when a German veteran pointed to a miniature Mustang model on the table and said, "He destroyed our planes, but it also destroyed our certainties. We believed ourselves to be invincible, and there we learned that no engineering wins alone." It is in this sentence that the historical irony that runs through this documentary is condensed, because it was not only the Luftwaffe that fell. It was pride, the dogma of tactical superiority, of isolated genius, of war won by a chosen few. The P-51, more than a fighter, was a lesson in the form of aluminum, gunpowder, and fuel, a lesson that the survivors, on both sides, have never forgotten. But even in the face of this mutual respect, a grim doubt remained. What if the Germans had had more time? What if his experimental projects had matured? The answer lay in the tunnels, the hidden factories, and the planes that never made it to heaven. In its last months of life, the Luftwaffe was no longer an air force, it was an armed memory. The doctrine that had sustained it since the shining days of the Blitzkrieg had been built on three pillars: technical superiority, training excellence, and short-lived tactical offensives. None of the three survived 1944. Pilot training schools were emptied, their instructors transferred to the front line or killed. The training camps, once methodical and demanding, began to train fighters in a hurry, some with less than 30 hours of flight time. The Luftwaffe, which had been born as the most innovative arm of Hitler's armed forces, now relied on teenagers thrown blindly against formations of B-17s protected by Mustangs in concentric circles. The planes that still existed were, in many cases, operational only on paper. With no fuel, no parts, and no qualified crews, entire units existed only on the spreadsheets of officers who knew they would not take off. Improvisation has become a doctrine, and the doctrine turned into despair. A clear example was the Sturmgruppen, squadrons formed to fly directly against enemy bombers in suicide attacks. Pilots were given explicit orders to crash, if necessary, into the bombing formations. A desperate gesture by a force that could no longer win or survive. In October 1944, more than 50% of Luftwaffe aircraft were unable to take off due to lack of basic resources. Every day the Reich lost not only machines, but the logic of its own air strategy. Heaven, which had once been the scene of his glory, had become his invisible graveyard. The Me-262, a game-changing jet fighter, arrived too late, in too small numbers, and with too unprepared pilots. Many were shot down before they even reached operational altitude. Technology without industrial and doctrinal support was nothing more than a promise. The arrogance that had once denied the need for long-range bombers or deep escorts now paid the price. The Luftwaffe did not fall due to technical inferiority. He fell because he was fighting a 21st century war with resources from 1940, and against an enemy that was already thinking about 1945. German doctrine had been designed for short victories, quick wars, localized combats. It did not foresee a war of logistical attrition where each destroyed plane was immediately replaced by the enemy, and never by them. He did not foresee an enemy capable of putting 2,000 fighters in the air in a single day and repeating the feat the next morning. Technical superiority dissolved into mathematical reality. General Adolf Galland, at the end of the war, bitterly declared, "We had brilliant ideas, but they had mass production, and in the end, that's what counts." The Luftwaffe, a symbol of innovation and tactical arrogance, was consumed by a war that required constancy, replenishment, and repetition. Traits that belong to American logistics, not German pride. When the bombers began flying with full escort, the Reich lost its last advantage, the initiative. And when it lost the initiative, it also lost the reason for existing. Hitler's air force died not in the air, but in the factories that stopped, in the schools that closed, and in the doctrines that did not evolve. All that remained now was the myth and the fear of what was yet to come. Because while the German planes fell silent, the Reich's radars picked up a new frequency, an increasingly intense wave of Allied signals, flying not just to destroy, but to occupy. The P-51 Mustang did not end its mission at the end of World War II. On the contrary, he has started a new era. Until then, air combat was thought of in tactical, short and defensive terms, protecting territories, intercepting invaders, supporting the ground advance. But the Mustang, with its extended range, heavy armament and ability to sustain a presence in enemy skies for hours, introduced a new concept, that of extended air dominance. From then on, fighter jets ceased to be border guardians and became instruments of strategic scope. It was the birth of a new doctrine, fighters that escort bombers thousands of miles, that pursue targets outside the front line, that sustain air operations for entire combat cycles. The Mustang taught strategists that modern warfare would be won not just by force, but by permanence. The lesson was absorbed by succeeding generations. The F-86 Sabre, in the Korean War, carried the spirit of the P-51 in its tanks. NATO's doctrine during the Cold War was designed on the principle that Western air power must always reach enemy territory and dominate it indefinitely. Even the in-flight refueling tactics common today are rooted in this concept, keeping the fighter in the air for as long as it takes to break the enemy's breath. The Mustang became a school, a manual with wings. His performance wasn't just an advantage of the time, it was an era divider. He didn't just win duels, he won mentalities. And the most ironic thing is that all this was born from a secondary project, hastily started to satisfy a British request. The solution to the war's greatest air challenge was literally on the drawing board, but the enemy underestimated it. Germany expected numbers, not reach. I expected resistance, not reinvention. The force that laughed at the lone bombers in 1943 was brought down months later by a fighter that was not supposed to exist, and for an industry that refused to fight within the limits imposed. The irony of this story is that the answer has always been visible, but only those who knew how to collaborate, adapt and scale managed to transform technology into power. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can continue to bring you content that reveals the technical backstage of the story. Because what started as a simple escort has turned into a global doctrine. Today, every fighter plane that crosses oceans carries, in its design, the DNA of the P-51. But the legacy is not only technical, it is philosophical. He teaches that long wars are won by ideas that last, and in the case of the Mustang, the idea was clear. Never fly to war again without having full control of the sky. And as the Allies redefined the future of aviation, in the caves of Germany, desperate engineers were testing another approach, a last-ditch attempt to turn the tide with weapons never seen before. What devastated the Luftwaffe most was not just the loss of planes or airfields, but the brutal collision between the doctrine they taught their pilots and the reality they saw in the skies. Many grew up hearing that the Western enemy was technically inferior, disorganized, unable to resist German engineering. The war, they said, would be decided by the purity of the race, the genius of engineering, and the tradition of individualistic piloting, the knights of the Luftwaffe, dueling with honor. But that narrative dissolved into closed formation, synchronized refueling, logistics that didn't fail. The Americans, who according to propaganda were weak, uneducated, dependent on numbers, appeared in the skies with mathematical precision steel discipline and weapons that worked. Its pilots, many without military ancestry, children of farmers, factory workers, or immigrants, did not fly with the arrogance of lineage. They flew with the weight of collective responsibility. Every Mustang that crossed Germany brought not only weaponry but a concept. No one would be left behind. Individualism has given way to the system, to cooperation, to scale. And that's what the German pilots couldn't combat, because there was no tactical honor possible in the face of an enemy that simply no longer made mistakes. One of the most symbolic accounts came from a German pilot shot down over Leipzig. When he was rescued by American forces, he looked at the P-51 that had shot him down and said, "They said it would be easy, but they came in formation, saw us before, locked us on the radar, and hunted us down. That's not how a weak enemy fights." This kind of admission revealed something greater than defeat. It revealed rupture. The doctrine of moral and technical superiority had been dismantled piece by piece. The mirror of war showed two opposing faces. On the one hand, the psychological collapse of those who lost more than planes. On the other, the moral discovery of a force that not only won, but redefined what it was to win. American pilots reported the weight of watching the enemy fall. There was no euphoria. There was respect, caution, and a growing sense that they were part of something historic. Each flight to Berlin was not just a mission, it was a statement. They were capable, they were numerous, and above all, they were organized. What began as an engine war has become a duel between beliefs. The idea that the Germans would win by genius was drowned out by the force of a society that mass-produced excellence. A war won not by isolated heroes, but by robust systems, cooperative engineering, and replicable training. If the Luftwaffe pilot was trained to be an ace, the American pilot was prepared to be part of an ecosystem. An individual mistake could cost lives, but the system corrected, adjusted, learned. The industry learned, logistics responded, the doctrine evolved. And that in the end was the invisible weapon of the United States. It wasn't just the Mustang, it was what was behind it. A whole war machine, yes, but also a new philosophy of combat, precision, permanence, and purpose. Meanwhile, in Germany, many wondered how it all fell apart so quickly. The answer lay in what they ignored, that the real power was not only in the weapons, but in how and why they were built, and that the moral force of a nation can, indeed, be more lethal than its engineering. But the story still had one last layer, because in the underground tunnels of Nazi Germany, hidden from Allied eyes, a project was taking shape. The Luftwaffe, in its final moments, was preparing a final letter, a weapon that, if it had flown early enough, might have rewritten the course of the war. Nazi Germany's greatest defeat in the skies was neither technical nor tactical. It was philosophical. They believed that war was still won with honor, bravery, and isolated ingenuity, concepts inherited from the past, tied to a romantic, elitist view of combat. They bet that their elite of pilots, modeled in military academies and extolled as quasi-mythological heroes, would be enough to contain a factory-built, mass-trained air force. They ignored that. In modern warfare, the engine that moves the airplane is less important than the engine that moves the society behind it. The United States was not seen as a serious threat. They were inexperienced, dependent on numbers, without a tradition of air warfare. The term battle for saturation was used with disdain, but it was exactly this saturation of production, of training, of adaptation that won. The P-51 was not just a fighter, it was the final expression of a doctrine based on technical humility and collective ambition. Each piece of it carried layers of lessons learned, quick fixes, integration of Allied knowledge. The British engine, the American airframe, the unprecedented range, the balanced armament, everything here was the result of collaboration, not pride. Germany looked at its planes as works of art. The United States looked at its own as tools that needed to work better every week. The war did not expect genius, it rewarded resilience, and in this game, underestimation was fatal. The Luftwaffe lost because it believed that tradition would win logistics, what skill would beat repetition. That past would win future, but the future arrived in the form of a fighter that shouldn't exist, flying farther than anyone imagined, and protecting the bombers that, until yesterday, were falling in droves. The Mustang taught a lesson that echoes beyond World War II. Never confuse silence with weakness. Never confuse quantity with mediocrity. Never confuse pragmatism with inferiority. The Germans underestimated America because they did not see what it was capable of building in silence. And when they realized it was too late, the Mustang was already over Berlin, and as the dust of war settled, a new question arose among the Allies. If we could achieve this together, what else would we be capable of? Because the plane that taught the Germans about humility would now teach the world about cooperation, and ignited the spark of a new kind of air power about to take hold. Decades after the last combat flight, the P-51 Mustang continues to fly, not in the skies, but in the memory of all who lived its presence. For Americans, it became more than an aircraft. It became the icon of the moment when the tide turned, the metallic symbol of a force that refused to accept defeat, adapted and won. At museums across the United States, such as the Smithsonian in Washington and the Plains of Fame in California, veterans walk quietly around restored Mustangs. Many touch the fuselage as if meeting an old friend. "That one saved my life," said a B-17 gunner, pointing to an exposed P-51. In interviews, it is common to hear the terms angel, protective shadow, brother in heaven. But what is surprising is that on the other side of the Atlantic, respect also exists. In German cities that were once targets, the Mustang has gone from nightmare to object of historical fascination. In 2001, in the city of Weimar, an elderly Luftwaffe pilot took part in an exhibition about the air war. Seeing a Mustang displayed in the center of the hall, he muttered, "When I saw this plane over Leipzig, I knew the end had come." There was no bitterness in his voice, there was acceptance. Reports like this are not isolated. German families preserved letters from pilots who crashed trying to defend their cities, and many of these letters mention the astonishment with the P-51, its speed, its accuracy, its persistence, and, interestingly, his humanity. An American pilot wrote after a mission, "I shot down an FW-190 today. I didn't feel a victory. I felt that I overcame fear, not man." In the 70s and 80s, meetings between veterans of the two sides began to occur more frequently. In one of them, held in Normandy, a former Mustang driver met with a former German pilot who had been his prisoner. They shook hands and talked for hours. Neither spoke the other's language fluently, but the most important words were simple: respect, survival, end. Some families discovered decades later that their parents had saved enemies. In a village on the outskirts of Frankfurt, a wounded American pilot was rescued by German civilians in 1944. They hid the man until the Allies arrived. In 2010, the pilot's children visited the same village to say thank you. On the wall of the house, there was still a fragment of the Mustang that had fallen. The war ends, but his memory is transformed, and the Mustang has become a bridge between generations, between former enemies, between horror and humanity. In books, movies, documentaries, and even video games, his silhouette continues to be drawn, not as a war machine, but as a character in history. It represents a moment when engineering and purpose aligned, when speed, range, and protection saved not only aircraft, but hopes. And what was once a tool of destruction has become an object of reconciliation. There are children in Germany today who build P-51 mock-ups in aviation clubs. There are American veterans who write letters to grandchildren telling how that fighter took them back home. Memory doesn't choose sides. It chooses stories that carry lessons. And perhaps the biggest one is this: even the most lethal of machines can, over time, teach peace. But even as we celebrate the memory of the Mustang, something needs to be said. What really ensured its flight were not just engineers or pilots. It was society that sustained them, factories that did not stop, minds that adjusted the impossible, communities that trained, nurtured, and fueled a global effort. The P-51 was a collective triumph, and that is its greatest legacy. But there is still one last reflection to be made, because in the end, the Mustang is just the visible tip of a much larger gear. And in conclusion, we'll reveal what this story really says about the modern world and what it forces us to never forget. In March 1944, the skies over Germany revealed a new empire, not of ideology but of scope. The Luftwaffe, once the absolute master of the altitudes, was now witnessing the collapse of its own doctrine, disintegrated not only by projectiles but by an equation they did not know how to solve: production at scale, cooperative innovation, and ruthless logistics. The P-51 Mustang was the messenger of this turn, but its real strength was not just in guns or speed. It was in what it symbolized: an entire country, its allies, its industry, and its engineering acting in unison. The victory of the heavens was not won with isolated heroes, but with gears that did not stop. And by the time Germany realized this, it was too late. The lesson is clear and definitive. In modern war, will is not enough. Bravery without supply is just noise. Whoever dominates the logistics chain shapes the strategy. Whoever shapes the strategy dictates the end. The Luftwaffe fell not because it fought less, but because it fought alone. While the Americans fought on a scale, in a system, in structure. We were defeated by trucks, Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of War Industry, would confess. An admission that says more than 1,000 reports. If you believe that the story needs to be told with data, courage, and accuracy, support our channel. Leave your like, subscribe now, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. And comment here. What was the most shocking fact in this story? Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.